Good evening, everyone. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Nyadol and Ngambri land, and I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and to all Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. My name is Daniel Gleeson, and I'm the Director of Community Engagement here at the Library, and it's my absolute pleasure to be welcoming you all here this evening. The issue of migration has been a hot topic ever since the British established a settlement at Port Jackson in 1788. Just consider that the early settlers considered any links to convicts to be distasteful, and that was referred to back then as sort of having the convict stain. But today, many Australians are coming here to the library to look into their own family history, and they're very proud and they're pleased when they find these connections to convicts. And then again, early government policy was populate or perish. And there was subsidised travel on offer for preferred migrant groups. But today's migration debate centres around the number of migrants, the effects on the price of housing, inflation, and a whole range of other issues. And of course, people who migrate to Australia come here for a whole range of reasons. Anything from seeking new opportunities, to be reunited with family, to study, to flee persecution, or even for love. So to explore these issues tonight, we have such a great panel. I'm so glad they have agreed to do this discussion for us tonight. I just want to express my thanks to the panel for agreeing to participate. It's a really rare thing to be able to get together a panel of this quality. Thank you so much, and I would like to hand over now to Claudia Chan Shaw.
Thank you so much, Dan. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's so lovely to see you here tonight. My name's Claudia Chan Shaw, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the library this evening for what's going to be a fascinating discussion. Now, we're here tonight because of the wonderful exhibition that's been developed by the National Library of Australia, Hopes and Fears, Australian Migration Stories. Have you seen the exhibition yet? Nodding. Good. Thank you. You can all have a lollipop afterwards now. So the exhibition, as you have seen, explores the history of migration to Australia through the eyes of government, society and individuals, and it includes posters and photographs and newspapers, oral history, mementos, diaries. And the exhibition asks, what were the hopes and fears that motivated migrants to leave their homelands to come to Australia? And what impact did that have on them and coming to their new home? So to answer these questions, we have four eminent Australians who have each got a personal and professional story of migration to Australia. So let's meet our panel. Mariam Veiszadeh, an award-winning human rights champion, lawyer, diversity and inclusion practitioner and social commentator. Mariam was born in Afghanistan and came to Australia in 1990 with her family as a refugee, and she's been a vocal champion of the rights of asylum seekers and refugees. Mariam is the Chief Executive Officer of Media Diversity Australia. Would you please welcome Mariam? Dhungel arrived in Australia as a student in 1998 before being granted a refugee visa following the Bhutanese government's persecution of ethnic Nepalese in southern Bhutan. Played a critical role in the settlement of over 5,000 Bhutanese refugees in Australia. He's the author of Bhutan to Blacktown, Losing Everything and Finding Australia. Would you please welcome Nyuon is a lawyer, community advocate, writer and public speaker. Nyadol was born in a refugee camp in Ethiopia and raised in the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. In 2005, she came to Australia as a refugee when she was 18 years old. In Australia, she completed her law degree, and she's a vocal advocate for human rights and multiculturalism. She's also a regular media commentator. In 2022, she was awarded the Order of Australia Medal, and she's the director of the Sir Velman Cowan Centre at Victoria University and chair of Harmony Alliance. Please welcome Nyadol. And Professor Brian Schmidt grew up in the United States. In 1994, he moved to Australia. Brian's now a distinguished professor and astrophysicist at the Australian National University's Mount Stromlo Observatory. He was Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University. He won the 2011 Nobel Prize in Physics, which provided evidence that the expansion of the universe is accelerating. Brian is also a viticulturalist who runs his own winery, Maipenrai, where he grows Pinot Noir. Would you please welcome Brian and all of our panellists? Now, the title of the exhibition is Hopes and Fears. And I'm particularly interested in the period where it was decided that you all would come to Australia. So the question is, starting with you, Mariam, what were your hopes and what were your fears?
I was a young child at the time, so I don't know how well articulated my hopes and fears were. I had really mundane concerns, like where my toys were and whether my mum had packed them. I remember that's one thing I, cross-examined my mother on, as to where were my toys and why weren't they packed as we were, fleeing and going from one country to another, selfishly as a child. I think if I can reflect on it as an adult, I think hopes and fears, I now as a parent understand the struggles of, I cannot imagine how my parents were able to flee a war-torn country, a war zone, with young children, and have to think about all the other things that come with that. I mean, I struggled to do the grocery run with my 2 kids, and I just lose it at the best of times. And I think, how do you, and I think this is a very live conversation because as we speak, war is ravaging across the Middle East and other parts of the world. And so I think for me, it puts a spotlight on reflecting on my own experiences and then being able to humanise the experiences of others. And just because we don't personally experience it doesn't mean we can't empathise with it. And so I think for me, I know that hopes of my parents was finding a safe place, let alone a land where your children and future generations can thrive, but just basic safety, where you are not being persecuted, where you are not at risk of being killed. And I also reflect on that, and I've done an oral history interview today for the National Library, which I'm really grateful to do, and I've reflected on my life and how we don't, there's a birth lottery and no one chooses the circumstances of our birth, and yet by pure chance, someone can be born in Australia, Sydney, Australia versus Kabul, Afghanistan, and we know that depending on where you are born, which you had zero control over, that can dictate and determine the circumstances of your life. So I'd say the hopes would have been opportunities, better opportunities, but at a bare minimum survival. And then in terms of fears is how that will play out, because the uncertainty is always a factor when you are seeking asylum.
And stepping into the unknown. What do you think? What was your experience?
Thank you. And I just want to bring warm greetings from Blacktown in Western Sydney. Well, after fleeing Bhutan, my wife and I, along with our daughter, we were living in Kathmandu as refugees. I volunteered to help set up schools and hospitals in refugee camps in Nepal, and we focused on advocacy, trying to go back to Bhutan. But after 5 years, nothing was happening. During that time, 3 of us were at a shopping center, and my daughter was about 3.5, 4 years old, and she was just behind us. And we looked for her, and she was looking at a beautiful dress there. And as soon as she saw us, she just dropped it and she just started walking. And said, "Darling, did you like the dress?" I said, No, Papa, it's okay. And my wife asked her, and she said, no, it's okay. And that day, we went home, and both of us cried, and she as a child, even she knew that she's a refugee and she can't afford it. So she didn't want to sort of, ask for it because she knew we couldn't afford it. And at that age, for a child to have that mindset, I thought it was very, it wasn't right. So that's when we decided maybe we need to start looking at, yes, things happened to us. We became refugees. But what do we do about it? Because one of the things is, you cannot control what happens to you in life, as I was just talking to Brian earlier. But I found that we can always choose to respond the way we want to. And that was the time we thought, okay, we need to do, looked at our daughter's face and said, we need to do something to change this situation. She needs to be able to go to a good school, get education, and be able to lead a good life. That's when I decided, my wife and I decided that maybe, let's look for other opportunities. And, she had some jewelries. We had whatever we had, we sold. And then I managed to pay, first semester tuition fees, and somehow managed to come here and start a new life all over again. Although, of course, I had to leave here for 3 years. Again, when you talk about hope and fears, it wasn't easy to leave away from my wife and our little daughter. And, I was lonely, I was exhausted, it was so difficult to find a job. I couldn't pay my tuition fees. So I was really lonely, exhausted, and consumed by anxiety. And I'd never been anxious like that, but I was lying awake the whole night. One morning, when I was after that, I couldn't sleep 5 consecutive nights at a stretch. And I was going to my work at a Coles supermarket in the city. I was crossing the intersection of George and Liverpool Street. And my vision started to blur. I fell and hit the ground. A stranger grabbed me and dragged me to the pavement. He might have saved my life, but he certainly changed it. So this is about, when you have, fear, but then you cannot separate that with hope. You get a second chance in life. If I had really been killed on that day, again, my daughter wouldn't be proud to say that, my father died because he was weak. So from that day onwards, I started, taking a different approach to life. Yes, there are things you can't control, and there's no point harping on that. And I was so anxious, so, thinking about my daughter and my wife and my parents. So all that, I started changing the way I was dealing with life. I kept them aside and focused on my studies, and I was able to move forward. So I think when you have hope, there's always a chance that you'll lead a new life. So it's about having that fear, but at the same time, if you're able to deal with that by, keeping things you cannot control, we tend to spend too much time on things that we cannot control. So how do we sort of focus on things that you can control? And that was a decision I made, and that has really changed my life in terms of how we have started now.
Thank you, Om. I think that's a lesson for all of us that could change our lives if we focused on things that, we can't control.
It wasn't easy, but
Yeah.
I think that was a life and death matter, so I had no choice. Thank you.
Nyadol.
I think with the arrogance of a 17-year-old, I was very clear about what my dreams are and what my fears were. The first was I wanted to get out of the camp. I was about at year 12, equivalent of year 12, running out of options. I knew I was loud enough not to make a good wife, so I thought I better get out of this place, because that was going to be the end of my education. So I think my dreams were to get out of the camp, go to uni, become a lawyer. And so, again, with the arrogance of a 17-year-old, I started negotiating with God directly. At night, when my mom goes to bed, I would just trade. And I knew I was an atheist, kind of, at the time. But I would sit there and I would say things like, if I go to Australia and I go to school, I'll be a good Christian, I'll always listen to Mom, I will never complain. And obviously now I complain when Trump's around 3 minutes late. And But I got lucky and I came to Australia, and I did achieve those dreams. I went on and did a BA, and then went on and did a law degree and became a lawyer in 2016. So God kept his promise. I didn't keep most of mine. And I think in a way, my fears didn't come until later. You know, like for as a 17-year-old, this place felt like it was going to be heaven. And it wasn't, I suppose, until sort of like 2007, you begin to see a lot of the media about African gangs. And so gradually you began to realize you never belonged and you were never considered to belong, and you will never be considered to belong because of who you are and how you look. And I think that's when the fear of place and belonging and where to go and who to be, I suppose, you know. Because it felt like everyone had assumptions about you. You know, like mainstream media has assumptions about who you are. Sometimes your family had assumptions about who you are, but you were somebody who had changed because of the things that have happened to you and where you had come. You know, I was not the same. I say, there is a person I am in this country that I cannot be anywhere else. You know, that I'll have to leave at the airport if I ever have to give that up. But there are times in this country where you do feel as though your ability to claim belonging is always negotiable. So I think that's the line you tread.
Maybe time for another bargain with God.
You know, maybe. I mean, so quick. Maybe yes. I mean, I went to Cuba, and it's not just an anecdote, but it was fun. And I was assumed to be Cuban. I have never been assumed to be Australian. So that was very telling in the sense of when we say someone is Australian, there's something we mean. And obviously, countries like Cuba and South Americans are quite different in that they have complex histories, and you know there's a difference between a racial identity and a national identity. But it's so sufficiently distant that someone like me can pop out of an airport and a Cuban look like me, or someone with blonde hair and blue eye. But in Australia, when we say an Australian, we know who that is. So I think when, you know, taking lead of that joke about praying again, is this idea of, are people like my daughter ever going to be assumed to be Australian when we think about what an Australian is? Maybe that is the new dreaming.
Brian, you made your way from the United States to Australia. What were your hopes and dreams?
So obviously I came under quite different circumstances than everyone else. I came, for me, to have a life with my family. My wife was Australian. And so my hope was to have a good life and to, you know, for my wife to have a good career, for me to have a good career, the kids to have a good upbringing. And that was framed very much by the expectations I had as a kid growing up in the United States. And I had a very good upbringing. And, you know, in the United States, you are, certainly of my era, indoctrinated into America is the best place in the world. Why would you go anywhere else? Now, I grew up in a very funny part of the United States, in Montana and Alaska, so very rural area, and so we didn't quite have the same indoctrination in the same way. So hope's very simple, just a good life. I started thinking about vineyards and things a couple years after I got here. Fears were fitting in. Am I going to fit in? Because although I'm not identifiably not Australian, I look like your classic Australian, my accent, even to this day, is still American. And when I first got here, that was commented on regularly. And, you know, you would get into a cab and say something, and
where are you
cab
from?
driver, no, they would say bloody Yank. And you're just like, whoa, okay, now I feel scared, right? What's going on? And so that whatever reason, that was my first 2 or 3 years. There were things like that. And then they kind of disappeared. Not for any other reason. I think Australia evolved a bit.
Or did you just get used to it? And
No,
it was water off the duck's back?
someone said that to me, you feel fear. Right? If it happened to me today, I'd still feel fear. Because it's said in a way that makes you feel fear. So that was really my only scare. Am I going to fit in? And for the first year, you don't really know.
So, first impressions of Australia and the expectations. Mariam, what were your first impressions of Australia? And did they fit what you imagined Australia would be?
Again, as a young child, it's hard to know exactly. I think first impressions, I think to the point that you made, like, given the circumstances we were in, anything else was incredible. So it's like, it's heaven, you know. And I think for me, I sense that because we moved countries so many times, and I felt that, you know, kind of as mundane as it is with your toys, but, you know, your surroundings, and then making friends at school, for example, because we lived in India. I went to school in India for a short time. We lived in Germany. I went to school in Germany for a short time. And I also knew all these languages, which I forgot, but that's another day. And then came to Australia. And for me, it was just like, is this it? Like, are we staying here? Like,
yes.
you know, so it was more about, I think I had a sense of that. I also remember being enrolled in ESL, English as a Second Language, for those of you who know. And so I think first impressions, everything is just perhaps overwhelming. I do remember, I have some memories about, you know, you've all heard about the lunchbox story, right? As migrants, my mum would give me, you know, interesting food, which I now love, but at the time I had zero appreciation for it, and I didn't want to be different. So I think first impressions was, yes, it's incredible, and there's a level of safety and perhaps freedom. I may not have articulated, thought about it in that way, but I think I also felt very welcomed. I, to this day, am Facebook friends with my ESL teacher. Many years ago on Twitter/X, I tweeted, I think it was off the back of a Q&A episode, it prompted me to tweet how grateful I was to Mrs. Patricia Brown from Penrith South Public School. My mum's in Blacktown, by the way. So
Good on you.
yeah, and somehow someone found my tweet and sent it to her, and then we became Facebook friends. And she is on par with my mum in terms of commenting on everything and saying how proud she is. And so it seemed I felt very welcomed by her in particular as my ASL teacher, and that I think this, you know, speaks to the role of educators, but also the role that each of us play in welcoming fellow Australians, and how you may take for granted how little, you know, that's not going to be. It actually means a lot when you're new, and so I think that's probably my first impressions. We did feel welcomed. It's only later in life that I came to realise just how different I was, and I think I became a lot more conscious of racism and all the different isms that exist in society as I got older. And I started to see them, you know, you've got the innocence of childhood where you don't really see difference and you don't think people can see your difference. And it's only as you grow up and you're exposed to different environments where you come out of that bubble and you realise, no, you are different. And it could manifest in different ways, comments about your lunchbox, or it could manifest in the looks that you get as you're walking somewhere with your parents and your family is visibly Muslim. And that point of difference, and I'm sure we'll get time to talk about this, but I think, you know, Australia has a very vexed issue with race, and many of us here could speak to it, and it's particularly relevant because today I've spent some time reading the ABC Racism Review that got released this afternoon and had to do some media on it, and so I've been really thinking about that quite a lot, and I'm happy to speak to it. But I think it is a formative experience for I'd say many, I'm sure the research can back that up, many migrants, where people do feel othered. And Australia this is one issue we really need to come to grips with and do a better job of navigating, whether it's at our national institution at the ABC, as the report has damningly shown today, or across the top echelons of Australian society. And the fact that you can live here your whole life and still not feel Australian, that your Australianness is constantly negotiable, as you've mentioned, that for me is always a fear. And no matter how much we move forward, we find ourselves when there are challenging circumstances, when we are tested, whether domestically or globally, when there are wars, that we are reminded we're not quite Australian enough.
First impressions, and did Australia live up to what you expected?
Well, my first impression about Australia is when I was a child. We had the government imported some cows, Jersey cows, from Australia. So that's when I first heard about Australia. And we had a cow, and I think from Australia, and it gave so much milk, we had to buy new buckets because.
What was the name?
Go-to. James called it go-to, but it's go-to.
Go-to.
Go-to guy. And it, for generations, it's given us milk, so I'm very grateful. So that's a start. But I was also, got my driver's training by an Australian, because when I was in Bhutan Telecom, I was the head of planning and development, and we hired some experts from outside, and one of the Australians happened to be one of the experts. And one day I invited him, my wife invited him for dinner, and a driver took us home, and he left home, and he said, why this fellow come? I said, no, he's our driver. He said, can't you drive? I said, no, I can't. So I didn't know how to drive then. So he said, from tomorrow I'll teach you. So he was the one who taught me. So there are a lot of good things that I started with Australia, so I'm really grateful. But again, coming to Australia, I think in the first place, of course, because I was a refugee seeking asylum. Now, when you get asylum, you don't have a fear of persecution. And everything else is a bonus. So I feel really grateful, and I get up every morning and thank government people of Australia for giving me a new life. And I think, yes, there are challenges. I travel a lot, and I've visited, I think, a number of countries. I travel all the time. And every country has problems and issues. And I'm personally being a victim of ethnic cleansing. Over 100,000, 1/7 of the country's population were made refugees. And you look at every country, there are challenges. But I'm a strong believer in individual power. Like there's a saying that if you think that you cannot make a difference, try going to bed with a mosquito. You have a mosquito net and a mosquito goes in there. One mosquito can ruin your sleep. So I believe in making that difference ourselves. So I strongly believe in that, and we are trying to do that in Blacktown. We sort of, rather than thinking ourselves as people from different countries or different places, different nationalities, because Blacktown, we've got people from 180 countries of birth, and we speak 182 languages. So if we start focusing on our differences, we would be fighting every day. So we have to look at what's common. We all want a safe neighborhood. We all want a green neighborhood. We all want a clean neighborhood. That's common. Once we have that common, it's a common platform. If you rock that platform, it disturbs everyone. So if you start having, taking that approach, I think we can create a prosperous Australia, and I strongly believe in that.
Nyadol, first impressions of Australia?
Oh, definitely. I think my first 5 years felt like, as I said, heaven. It was. I was really excited to just get things going, and I think I might have gone to a school that I saw and asked the principal if I can enroll myself, and they asked me to go get my mum. But that's how excited I was. I was ready to go. It was a huge opportunity for me. I knew that I wanted to pursue certain things, and I knew I couldn't do it in a refugee camp. And so the first impressions were of a place that gave me a new lease of life. And I still think to some degree there is that. I think when there was the African gangs and so many other incidents of sort of like public sense of exile, I suppose, And in a way it is, because I mean, I came to this country as a stateless person, so that we'd been refugees for so long that we were considered stateless. So the only country I've ever had a passport for, that I've ever officially been a citizen of, is Australia. And so even though, you know, people who know me will know I'm South Sudanese, or my parents are from that, officially this is the only record of citizenship I've ever had anywhere. And so I suppose there's this sense of psychological exile, you know, when the kind of media commentary and the hostility that sometimes is visceral occur. And so you go from this idea of hope and dreaming to this is hell and I hate it. And then you grow up and you realize that's just life. And there is there's so much that is true and unacceptable, but there's so much as well that, you know, is amazing and rewarding. You know, two of my best friends are, you know, white men over 60. But I say that both as a joke, but I think also the fact that I think when we talk of immigration, we can become it can be very homogeneous. We can begin to think of those people and lump people up so much that we forget that you are, I don't know, someone with a South Sudanese background, you came to Australia, you are also a you, and you change, and you have expectations that are different from your parents, that are different from your, you know, from your community. So I always tell, you know, the way I give an example is my mother is not an Australian at all. She didn't come to this country. She didn't want to come. She came for her kids, has no interest, you know, of being here. And then you've got people like myself who came as a 17-year-old, and so you can see some of those things. And you know, my brother was born here. I don't think he even knows he's black. You know, so you've got to, you see this sort of transition of who they think they are and what their dreams are and what they want. You know, people might tag them what they think they look like, but who they are and their dreams and their expressions and what they want to do are so different from what a typical South Sudanese young person is doing in South Sudan right now. And I think that's what gets missed in a lot of the way we talk about Australian stories and about even migration is the fact that you might not look like the typical Australian, but your way of being and your expectations and what you want to do become part of the collective of what it is to be Australian. You see young girls, young Sudanese girls, I tell them they're very lucky, by the way, because I was not allowed to move out of home, but they now travel for a year. You know, this is a very typical, you tell a Sudanese parent that back in South Sudan, you would be told to go get married or something. I'm joking. But the point is the dreams and the goals that they have. My brother's dreams are to play football. That's a very Australian AFL game. Like, you know, so that get missed, and we get lumped either as the way we look or what we wear or who we worship, or there's an assumption that somehow we got stuck at the point of landing in this country and then nothing else happened. You know, but you are formed and transformed by the places that you are in. And I think that's where now, as a almost 40-year-old with 2 kids who were born here, that's the reality of not seeing it so black and white, right? But not also undermining the things that are bad. There's no joke that racism is here, but there's also truth in that this country has some really good, wonderful things that it can be and can improve on, and we should take pride in that to the extent that it's permissible.
I bet you never thought when you left Kenya that you would be an AFL fan.
No.
What happened to you?
Something really bad. I remember sitting in a train in Melbourne. I was heading back to my house, and it was a Friday, and I had a sense that something was completely wrong. And I kept thinking, what is going on? What is it? And I realized it was Friday night footy. And I truly thought, yes, I've become one of them.
Melbourne girl. Brian, what were your first impressions of wonderful Australia?
So for me, almost everything was, you know, compare and contrast with the United States, where I'd grown up. So there were things straight out of the gate where you're just like, wow, the food has, the Asian fusion had come through at this point. Yeah. I had visited Australia for 3 months, twice in 80 and 85, and it was very old English at that point. The food was not that good, and then 90 94, 95 when I arrived, it was great. And just going to the supermarket, things were good, high quality, cheap, great. Really took an instant like to AFL and cricket. I was like, okay, that's fine. And then there were other things that seemed a bit backwards. Just the whole technology here just wasn't quite the same. You know, we used old things. The house, single glazed windows in Canberra. I grew up in Alaska. You die if you have single glazed windows. And you know, people don't die in Canberra. They spend a huge amount of money on gas as we did. I mean, we used more gas to heat my house in Weston Creek than my parents used to heat their house in Alaska. Wow. Because it was so poorly built. And so it was just things like that. There was a real frankness at some level that I enjoyed. But there was a tolerance for overt racism and misogyny that I had heard about my grandma talk about, kind of in pre-World War II in the United States, but that was quite a shock. And it's still around, not like it was, but it was a real shock at the beginning. And then the other thing is I realized is, wow, it is a long ways to everywhere from here. And I really appreciated that first year, and I still appreciate that.
See, now, I'm feeling a little left out here because I was born in Australia. My Chinese family has been in Australia since the gold rushes. I don't like AFL and cricket.
Neither do I.
You got a problem?
Thank you, Mariam.
You may lose your citizenship. They're going to come carry you away.
I'm un-Australian. I also don't own a pair of thongs. How's that? Mariam, we know that more than half of all Australians are either migrants or the children of migrants. So why don't we see this diversity in the media or in senior leadership roles?
I could talk all day. I wanted to just make one point, just reflecting what was said before I come to that. And as you were talking in particular, I think the ultimate test for being Australian and being accepted as migrants is when all of your achievements are celebrated and owned as you're a great Australian, in the same way that perhaps your mistakes are overlooked as individual. Oh, that's okay, you made a mistake, it's okay. And I just feel if that could be the test, it's an easy way to go, we celebrate migrants when they're good and they say things we agree with and they're winning. Gold Logies, AFL championships, you know, all sorts of things. But if they step out of line and they say something we don't agree with, because that doesn't happen to be my lived experience, we don't go, and I think we don't just go, you made a mistake, we say, people like you. And that for me is the test of migration, of when you'll become an Australian, when my mistakes are my mistakes alone, and that you do not conflate them with those people that look and sound like me, however loosely they're connected to me. And that's the ultimate test, because what I want to understand is, you know, do we all get told to go back to where we came from, or is it just the ones that don't look typically Australian? And that's something that I grapple with, and I don't want to be all negative and doomsday, but apologies, maybe it's because the ABC Racism Review came out and I got my head in that. But I think in terms of your question, this is related, because you talk about media and why we're not seeing... Diversity is not a trend. It's not going away. It's not like... We've been talking about this at a few conversations I've been having in the last few days. And it is here to stay. Diversity is not a minority, it's a majority. And there's a saying that equality feels like oppression for those that are accustomed to privilege. So, yes, Australia is evolving. The face of Australia is evolving, and maybe that makes some people deeply uncomfortable. I get that, right? But also, you can't deny a reality. Like, whether we like it or not, this is Australia. We are diverse. And this attitude of go back to where you came from, or I was born here and you flew here, or the reality is you, and I don't mean you individually, but just in general, you didn't choose the circumstances of your birth. We have all won the postcode lottery or the country of birth lottery. And so by virtue of things you cannot control about yourself, why are we so proud of something you didn't do anything to achieve, that you happen to be born in Australia as an Australian? That isn't, you know, I get that. But to then, I suppose, anyway, I digress. But media, executives, top echelons of Australian society, there are barriers in place for people who don't fit the norm. And there's ample research across every single industry that proves this. My expertise at the moment is media. There's research, Media Diversity Australia, that has done, it's called Who Gets to Tell Australian Stories? More importantly, who doesn't get to tell Australian stories? And what that shows is that representation is not there. And the reason it's not there, the diversity of Australia is not represented on screen and behind screen. And the reason it's not there is because there's systemic barriers in place. It's not because people lack merit, it's because despite the diversity coming in the profession, it's not moving up into the industry. And we find that that statistic plays out across every industry. So when we know there are systemic issues in place, then it's about how do you address those systemic issues. Because this idea of we live in a meritocracy and if you just work really, really hard, you'll get that job, it's a myth, and there's books written about it. And so there is systemic issues in place, and which is why we're not seeing the diversity. And across any other, and we also, you know, as I said, the ABC Racism Review, but this is across the board, it's not just the ABC. There is racism, sexism, bullying, harassment, a whole host of systemic issues that play out across industries. Now, the media, however, is if you think about migrants coming here, their experiences of Australia might just be through the media. And media is a shopfront to society. The shopfront has to reflect what's inside the shop, and it doesn't. It doesn't. It's misleading and deceptive conduct at this point. And so it's starting to change, but media is a loudspeaker for cultural change. At any time, at any given issue, how it plays out in the media is incredibly important, because if all you've heard about and seen around First Nations issues is through the media, and we know in the last several decades the representation of Indigenous issues have been appalling, which is why you get a situation where a referendum can fail because the truth-telling has never happened in this country. And so who tells your stories, how they curate those stories, whose perspectives they include, who they choose to interview, how they frame it, what words they use is important, and ultimately influences what you think of that person, of that demographic. And what Media Diversity Australia is doing, and you mentioned Sudanese gangs, Nyadol, and how this has been such a huge problem. This week, on Thursday, which is why I'm running around like a headless chook and constantly on my phone, we have hosting an MDA symposium and launching a race reporting handbook that was commissioned by the Australian Human Rights Commission. It's written by journos for journos, and it's a guide on how to report inclusively on issues related to race. Do you need to mention that they are Sudanese gangs, or do you say it's a youth crime? Do you need to mention Lebanese gangs? And why don't we identify the Bra Boys as Anglo gangs? Do you need to mention race in certain sentences, in certain phrasing, in certain headlines, or not? And would you have mentioned one's race if their race was of an Anglo background? And so it feels, the fact that we even have to say it, but in the media, because lived experience of these various backgrounds is not commonplace, particularly across commercial networks, where I think the representation on breakfast television of cultural diversity sits at 0.3% last time we checked, commercial television breakfast shows. So when that representation is not there, when Black Lives Matter happens live and there's no one live that can speak to that issue from a place of lived experience, and therefore they say factually inaccurate things live on air, this is why representation is important. But do it in a way where it's not tokenised. So, yeah.
Thank you, Mariam.
No worries.
Dear Om,
Yeah.
In your book, Bhutan to Blacktown, Losing Everything and Finding Australia, you wrote, I lost my possessions, my salary, my status, my career, my country. And in that fall, I gained everything. What did you gain in Australia?
Well, I was just talking to Dan earlier. If I was still in Bhutan, I would have been retiring as a bureaucrat. Now, everything seems to happen for a reason. Now, I fled my country, leaving behind my wife and our 2-year-old daughter, never knowing I would ever see them again. Fortunately, we reunited again, spent the next 6 years volunteering, helping set up schools and hospitals in refugee camp. And then again, I was a little crazy, dreamt about doing an MBA as a refugee. And as Nyadol was talking about, I used to, one of my cousins sent me a photo of UTS building. And I used to look at the photo every evening before going to bed, close my eyes, go into level 16, level 17, attend my class, and then after the class, I'll go to sleep. I'll do the same thing in the morning before I go out. And then it just happened. Now, this is something, I visualized, and it did happen, somehow. But, again, if I hadn't become a refugee, perhaps a lot of things that I'm doing now, I wouldn't have been able to do. So when you're actually going through whatever you're going through, this is where I share this with a lot of people who come as migrants or refugees. We go through a lot of struggles, and I think life is meant to be a struggle. It tests you. And then, there's always a day following a night. So similarly, when you're down and out, when, I've lived 3 times now. Once I was, attacked and left dead. My head was split. Again, I managed to survive. Another time, again, I had to flee the country and managed to survive that. And then again here, I collapsed on the street. I survived that. So I think, given what I've gone through and given what I've been able to do, having seen what, people go through, my only, purpose in life is to see if I can be of any help, any service to another human being. And since the arrival of Bhutanese refugees here, in 2008, I was able to follow their journey, and I've seen this in refugee camp where, we couldn't really apply for funding as we do here in Australia. We had to actually look at what everybody could do, mobilize that, make relations, make connections, and then help each other. So I thought, why don't we adopt a similar approach here? And when the refugees arrived, rather than leaving them to a service provider, we started, helping refugees to help themselves. And a lot of friends actually in the sector sort of were scolding me, said, why did you make them to volunteer? And volunteering was a key thing for, newly arrived refugees. They said, okay, I'll go and receive somebody at the airport, but the next day it's you who will go and receive somebody else. That way, you kept engaged, and you're not waiting for, the services to be provided for you. Rather, you are actively engaged. And once you start engaging, then finding a job becomes a lot easier, because I had a lot of challenges finding a job here in this country, which we'll talk about later, I think. So I think, given what I've gone through and given what we have been able to do together as a community, I think I've gained so much in terms of being able to give back to the community, wider community, not only my own family, but to the broader community.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Nyadol. Hello. You recently returned to Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. This is where you grew up. Can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, nearly 20 years after leaving, I went back with UN Australia for UNSCR to go back to Kakuma to try and raise some money for schools. It was a really interesting experience. It felt as though I had not left, partly because you got there and there were people who you left 17, 18, 19 years ago who were living in the same mud houses, no electricity. Like it did look like you'd just pop out to get milk and come back. And their life was still the same, yet you were so aware of how much your life has changed. And the only difference was that you went to a country that could provide you opportunities and they didn't. It wasn't that you were any more smarter or talented or anything. So that was really confronting, but there was some joyful stuff, and going back in the camp and seeing the amount of young girls that are now in school. And when I was there was much more fewer numbers. And I think the most interesting experience for me was that I thought I had this big purpose for going to the camp, of course. And I got there and I realized I had no purpose. As in, I was holding on to an identity that I think was time to give up. I think when I was born and raised in refugee camps, and I think you can really construct an identity around survival. Everything has to be earn and work hard, and everything is, at survival-like level. And I think that's why, parents who come here or migrants, you are a lawyer, engineer, or a disappointment to your family if you don't make another thing. I stole that from a comedian. It's not my job.
I think doctors one of them too.
But it was going back to the camp, and then after that I went to Morocco for the first time, and I remember just watching people, all these tourists, and I just there, not doing anything. And I thought, you can do this. You actually can just go somewhere and just be there. That, to me, is probably one of the greatest gifts I think safety gives you. Being in Australia gives you the opportunity to know what is equally a human inheritance, what it is to be just not in survival. I think it is, survival is essential, but at some point it is as dehumanizing when you don't have any other options but to survive. And I think what safety in Australia has allowed has been, in a sense, the ability to give up that identity and then find out what is available to be beside that. And I think that, to me, especially going from a camp to a different place, that difference was really a clarification of what it has actually meant to be safe for those 19 years when I was here.
Thank you. Brian, you were formerly the Vice-Chancellor of ANU. Education is Australia's 4th largest export, and there's talk of a cap to international student numbers. So what does a cap on intake of student numbers from overseas mean to our universities?
Yeah, well, it's going to be a big shock. And it's a shock that's probably 15 years in the making, where there has been what I describe as a sort of a subversive agreement between government and universities, that governments will spend less on universities if universities are allowed to make up the income by bringing in more international students. And I mean, I'm very blunt on what happened. Other people are not so blunt in the public, but that's what's happened. And both government and universities need to think very carefully about that agreement and what it means. I mean, is education and our universities a commodity? A little bit, but how much of a commodity? Are the students coming in creating housing shortages in Australia? Well, the answer is a little bit, but they're not the main driver. They're a driver, but they're not the main driver, but they're a convenient thing to complain about. Do they generate $50 billion in export income? Yes, and so if you're a treasurer who just very proudly ran an $18 billion surplus, $32 billion of that's going to go away if you just get rid of this, right? So we need to find an equilibrium where I think we treat the students who are coming in with dignity and respect and give them a great opportunity. And Australia is going to continue to be a very strong migrant country, and it's a great pool of people to have come to our country, have great skills, they're going to have good English, they're going to have all these things that will make them successful immigrants. So I don't think we should be ashamed of that. But we also have to acknowledge that just treating them as a commodity isn't okay either. And like it or not, a bit of that has occurred. So I think there's going to need to be some changing of the structure of things. I don't think $50 billion of export income is sustainable based on public opinion and all sorts of other things. But I don't think zero is the right answer either. So hopefully we'll come to an agreement. But the challenge we have is that the funding of the university system is very dependent on the current arrangement. And the decision by government to just pull back one lever and not replace the funding they have withdrawn over the last 15 years, well, that will have consequences. And we're about to see them because it's very clear they're going to pull one lever and not the other. So expect big shocks in the higher education. It's a very good time for me not to be Vice Chancellor.
Okay. You left the position in January this year.
Yes, November 31st. I gave Genevieve the keys on the 1st of June.
Hallelujah. Now, I have a final question for you. Would you believe it's come to that time? A final question for you all. Can you tell me, just in one word, what is Australia to you? Mariam?
Home. Home is where... Sorry, did I...
Did you chip into your word? That's all right.
I promise I didn't know. Home is where you can be comfortable, where you can eat all the junk food in the world and no one will judge you. You can not have your hair washed for 3 days and no one will know.
Yeah, that was COVID too.
Yeah.
Love that.
And you can dress however you like. It's where you can be good, but also lazy. And home still accepts you and doesn't judge you. And so Australia for me is home. I'm not going anywhere. But equally home is a place where you can go, I'm so happy and comfortable here. But when something is not working and you need to call a plumber and get it fixed, that you can still complain about home and not be called un-Australian.
One word.
Home.
Home. Okay, I'm moving on.
I was stateless for 12 years, and I so much wanted to belong.
Yeah.
Australian citizenship gave me that sense of belonging, and a home in Blacktown gave our family not just an identity, but a new life. So for those of us who have fled our homeland and found a sanctuary in this beautiful country, it's an incredible privilege to be an Australian citizen. It's an incredible privilege, so it's definitely a home. Thank you.
What's your word, Nyadol?
Free.
Free. Free.
That's just my covert way of saying being Australian is being Victorian, which is Victoria is the best. It's just a covert.
So what was your word? AFL?
Footy. Just
Footy.
footy. Just footy. But have you ever been in Melbourne during the grand final as they're just about to blow the whistle and you hear the noise? It's holy ground.
I was stuck in the traffic.
Okay.
I was stuck in the traffic.
Brian, one word.
So my word is livable. And I use that because I have chosen Australia to be my home. And I could live anywhere on the planet. But I choose to live in Australia because compared to any other place I've been, Australia is the most livable place that I've been. And it's not that it's perfect. There's lots of things I want to fix. But in the end, it's just a great place to live.
Perfect. 3 little words. Home, footy, livable. They say so much. Our Nobel laureate, Professor Brian Schmidt's Nobel Prize in Physics, provided evidence that the expansion of the universe is accelerating. And maybe that's something, that discovery, something that we can put into our own lives, that we keep expanding, that we keep accelerating our humanity, our tolerance, and our hope. Mariam Veiszadeh, Dhungel, Nyadol Nyuon, Professor Brian Schmidt, thank you for sharing your stories with us tonight. We celebrate your achievements. You are all trailblazers, and you're inspiring Australians. Would you please thank our panellists?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. That was just the best. Such a fantastic discussion. I'd like to mention a couple of other events quickly that we have coming up here at the library. If one astrophysicist tonight wasn't enough for you, come back tomorrow night because we've got another one. We've got Carly Noon coming in. She is the co-author of the acclaimed book, First Knowledge's Astronomy Sky Country. Carly will be joined in conversation with technology communicator Celeste Carnegie to discuss the astronomic heritage of the Kamilaroi people. And then next week on Tuesday, author Peter Crowley will launch his debut book, Townsend of the Ranges. We're so proud to be publishing this book, which is the biography of Scott Townsend. He surveyed huge areas of New South Wales and Victoria in terrible conditions in the 1800s. And then on Friday next week, we are hosting Australian musician Casey Chambers, and she'll be celebrating the release of her book. Slight rude word warning coming up. It's called Just Don't Be a Dickhead, another profound things that I've learned. Casey will also play us a couple of songs as well. So please register for any of those events via the library's website. That's it from me. Ladies and gentlemen, before we say goodnight, can I ask you again for another round of applause for our fantastic panel this evening?